Okay, so welcome everybody to this seminar, which is organized by the Linguistics Department in the Linguistics Department seminar series at Macquarie University, and also co-organized by the Multilingualism Research Center at the university. I'm Phil Benson, I'm the director of the center, and our Macquarie speaker, Sue Ollerhead, is also a member of the Multilingualism Research Center and a member of the School of Education. As I said, we're recording the seminar, and this is the third in a series of 4 that we're holding in October and November. And all of those will be, well, the 2 that have happened already are uploaded to YouTube on our YouTube channel. But if you just search YouTube for the title of the seminar, you'll find it quite easily. So I'll begin with Acknowledgments of Country. We acknowledge the traditional custodians of the Macquarie University land, the Wallamadagal clan of the Darug Nation, whose cultures and customs have nurtured and continue to nurture this land since the Dreamtime. We also acknowledge the traditional custodians of the various lands on which you all work today, and the Aboriginal and Torres Strait Island people participating in this seminar. We pay our respects to elders past, present, and future. And just before I hand over to Sue, I know that we have participants and audience from pretty much all over Australia, I think. So some from Melbourne, some from Adelaide, possibly from Canberra. So welcome to anybody who's joining us from outside Macquarie University. So let me hand over to Sue.
Thank you very much, Phil. Okay, let's just get this working. All right, well, I think we should start with some introductions. And first of all, I want to thank you all for putting aside Friday afternoon and tearing yourself away from the US elections. I know it's hard, but the big pleasure of this time for me is to be able to sort of connect with my colleagues and friends, Julie, Choi, and May French. We've been working together over the last 5 or so years, but it feels a lot longer. And so, yeah, we'll just quickly introduce ourselves, and then as the talk unfolds, you might get a better understanding of how our work sort of gels together. So for those of you who don't know me, I'm Sue. I work in the, I'm a lecturer in languages and literacy education at Macquarie. And I'll hand over to Julie to introduce herself.
Hi everyone, I'm Julie and I'm a senior lecturer in education at the Melbourne Graduate School of Education.
Hi everyone, I'm May. I'm an adjunct lecturer with the University of South Australia, but I'm speaking to you from Canberra today.
Just to keep things very interesting. So thanks to all of you who've joined us from those places and other places around Australia.
So I think this is a proper place for me to jump in here to maybe talk about some of our collaborations in the past and some of the work that we're going to continue to do. So we've all done work in this area separately, zooming in on, as you see here in the left side of your screen, zooming in on classrooms and schools. And as you can see, we're all interested in the teaching and learning area. So that has to be a huge reason why we have and continue to collaborate on projects. I think in 2017, we came together to co-edit a book, which is on the screen here, Plurilingualism in Teaching and Learning, which was published in 2018. It's bringing a focus on the importance of recognizing complexities across contexts, and basically to show that there are so many things to consider, and a one-size-fits-all, type of approach really doesn't work when we're talking about something as complex as multilingual language usage. So that's the work that Sue and I collaborated on, and May's chapter is also in the book. I wondered, May, if you could speak about the work that you did with Sue for the British Council.
Yeah, so the British Council publication, you can see they're using multilingual approaches, moving from theory to practice. This is a resource book for teachers, and there was quite a group of us worked on it, brought together by Kathleen Hugh at the University of South Australia, and we were all focused on multilingualisms and diversities. So our job was to put together a resource book for teachers working in low resource contexts, teaching English as an additional language or a foreign language or in EMI contexts. And this work was taken to seminars in India and Thailand, I believe. And so we took our experience working with students in lots of different contexts and tried to make it translatable to classrooms or learning spaces that may not have walls like classrooms that we know, or may not have those kinds of resources. But the real resources that those classrooms have are the languages of the students and the languages of the teachers. Now, this is an open access resource, so I encourage you to have a look, because really all of that work is sort of adaptable to different contexts, so it's certainly worth thinking about.
Yeah, and the link to the access is at the end of these slides, so easy to find. All right, thanks Julie and May. We thought we might sort of roughly divide this this seminar into three parts, but really it's about the three of us talking about our work in conversation. So we're probably going to interrupt each other and ask questions of each other, and we encourage you to do the same. I'll probably start the ball rolling just with a bit of contextualization around the idea of translanguaging as a theory and a practice. We realize that everybody sort of comes to translanguaging from a different standpoint, has a different understanding of it, and possibly different application of it. So this is really how we understand translanguaging and what it means for our work. And then May is going to take it right into the classroom and show us how it's informed teaching and learning in schools mostly, and also applications to other contexts. And then Julie will round it off by talking about our collaborative work, particularly a very recent journal that we co-edited for the Australian Journal of Applied Linguistics. So I will just start just by contextualizing our work in multilingual Australia. You know, Phil and Alice and other colleagues from the Multilingualism Research Centre have done some fantastic work on looking at the multilingual nature of Sydney. So this kind of follows on from that in looking at Australia as a really diverse, culturally and linguistically diverse country. We know that over 35% of Australians speak a language other than English or a LOT at home. And over 300 different LOTs are spoken at home. Big language groups are Mandarin and Arabic, but we're seeing a big rise in Hindi, Spanish, Punjabi, and that has implications for the types of work that happens in the classroom. Where I am in New South Wales, we're one of the most diverse states, and you can see there that only 64% of students speak English only, but 36% speak languages other than English. So that's a sizable part of the school population. And that really does have implications for the way that learning unfolds in classrooms. Now, the New South Wales government recognises that, and the Australian government recognises that our classrooms are diverse. But what they have said is that it's really important for all teachers, not just teachers who are trained in language acquisition, but all teachers across the board, from your maths, history, English teacher, to be able to accommodate students who speak a language other than English in their classroom. And that they should really actively invite them to share their cultural and linguistic knowledge and experiences in the classroom, which sounds fantastic, and we support that wholeheartedly. What we found by our work in schools and in classrooms, because that's the type of research that we all do, is that our teachers, our mainstream teachers, often feel very ill-equipped to meet the language needs of students from language backgrounds other than English. And when that happens, when they don't feel equipped to cater for their needs, we often find them framing the students in a deficit way. So Mr. Adonio says that we are so busy defining English as an additional language learners as problems that need to be fixed, that we've lost sight of the fact that they are the most linguistically savvy learners in our school. So instead of celebrating the richness and diversity they bring into our classrooms, they conceptualize their needs as problems. And this fits quite neatly into Richard Rez's work on language as problem versus language as right and language as a resource. We find often, unfortunately, in contexts where teachers feel inadequately equipped, they adopt a language as problem mindset. So that this is the mindset that where students who don't have proficiency in the dominant language, and obviously in Australia, that's English as a medium of instruction, often that's understood by teachers as the students themselves being deficient in their ability to think and learn. This is in direct contrast to a language as resource standpoint, which actually advocates for a pluralistic society over an assimilationist society, which says that everybody must come into our school system with whatever languages they have, but they must exit our school system with just English. That's not the society we envisage. So a language as a resource orientation regards language as an asset in our country, in our communities, as a really useful tool for building economic and social bridges across different communities. Okay, so why is this important educationally? Remember, we're locating a lot of our research in the classrooms, and we start with very young learners, and currently we're doing a project with kindergarten learners in a diverse school in Sydney, and we're seeing that well-meaning parents often stop their children from using their home language at home because they want to prepare them for life in Australia, for school in Australia. And so they think, well, if they only speak English at home, then that will better prepare them for the classroom. However, we know from scholars like Fred Genesee, educational psychologist, that there's a very important relationship between the dominant language, the dominant language development and learning a new language at school. The child's second language practices only really emerge in interrelationship with what they already know. So they move from the known to the unknown. So if they have strong first language development, they can very readily build their English language development on top of that. If they have shaky, first language development because their parents decide to switch to English at home and maybe not even give them a very good model of English, then we find that they actually don't develop their first language literacy or their second language literacy entirely. And that's not where we want them to be. So what does this mean for our teaching in schools? We know that content and language integrated learning programs where the focus is on development of the home language and the new school language simultaneously, teaching history through 2 languages, teaching maths through 2 languages is ideal, but it's just not feasible in a country with so many different languages other than English. So what we found is the most flexible way to support the continued development of diverse home languages is through the use of pedagogical translanguaging. And that is really what we're going to talk to today. A lot of you have heard of the term translanguaging, and you know that Ophelia Garcia describes it as the act performed by bilinguals of accessing different linguistic features or various modes of languages in order to maximize communicative potential. So let's have another look at that definition. What are we actually talking about? We're actually talking about 2 different ways of looking at language. We're looking at language as a noun. We're looking at language as, groups of features identified by society as French, Urdu, English, Punjabi, as a result of socio-historical processes. These are important aspects of our society, and we don't pretend they don't exist. These are the modes through which much teaching and learning happens in our schools. But we are also looking at from another perspective, and that is an internal perspective, the act of languaging, languaging as a verb. And this is where we look at language as a complex, interrelated repertoire of features and practices that we use to express ourselves. So instead of having bounded, separate languages existing without any relation to each other, we look at the languages that we do have as an integrated repertoire that we tap into when we want to communicate. And as educators, we believe that keeping these two perspectives in mind is really, really important. We know that we have to support our students' language in the classroom. We know we have to support them to succeed in English in Australian classrooms. So part of our job as teachers is to teach students to perform in English or other named languages wherever you are around the world in ways that are recognized by the school. So we know, unfortunately, that we have to prepare them for things like NAPLAN, for the HSC, for all the assessments they have to do. But at the same time, we recognize an internal perspective of language where we recognize that students bring multiple linguistic and cultural resources and identities. And we want, as educators, to make them feel that those identities are not only welcome, but essential to their learning in the classroom. Now, I don't want to spend too much time on this because I know that May will give you a much better snapshot of what that looks like. But I just want to finish off my section by quickly looking at how translanguaging has developed as a very, very significant concept in equitable educational practices today. We've moved away from 20th century ideas of territorialized languages. And we know that with globalization, transnationalism, digital media, that we are communicating across time and space. And so languages are coming into contact with each other. They're mixing with each other. Children and in schools are speaking a number of different languages at home and in the classroom. And so we've moved away from this idea of a bilingual person as being 2 or 3 monolinguals in one person to a 21st century understanding that looks at bilingual people holistically as integrated wholes who actually tap into the most meaningful language that they have in their repertoire in order to make sense of their learning and of the world. How am I doing for time, Julia and May?
About 4 minutes to go.
Oh, okay. This is my last, well, second last slide. There is a solid theoretical basis for this viewpoint, and that is based in Jim Cummins's work, which underpins a lot of the work that we do. And that is that idea of the interdependence hypothesis. So Cummins posits that a language learner is a bit like a dual iceberg, with the first and the second language being the 2 tips of the iceberg that we can see above the surface, but with a common basis that connects the 2 languages below the surface. And at the tips of the iceberg, he represents as BICS, and the base are related to CULP. And for those of us who are EAL teachers, we know really well that BICS refers to those basic interpersonal communication skills, the social everyday language that our students use. And this BICS can be quite deceptive. As teachers, we know we have students who come into our classrooms and they're very verbal, they communicate very well. It's only when we see their written work that we realize there are big gaps in their ability to access the content of the classroom because of their language, the lack of access to academic language. So that cognitive academic language proficiency is the formal academic language that they need to use in higher level thinking. This is essential for success in school because it's used for analysis, for reasoning, for critical thinking, for other cognitive processes. And we cannot leave our EAL students just with BICS. They really do need this CULP to be able to succeed in school. So important to the work that we do is the idea that if a language learner already has CULP in their first language, they have prior knowledge that would help them to succeed with the same concept in the new language. So for example, if we have a student arrives in a Sydney classroom and they are from the Sudan, for example, and they are fully able to tell the time in Juba or any Arabic or any language that they have, we know that they have that cognitive academic language proficiency. It's just that it's coded in another language. So it's not that they don't understand how to tell the time, it's just that they cannot do it in English. So what we know is that what a learner knows in their first language can positively transfer to their second or third language. We need to give them space in the classroom to be able to access that knowledge in their first language to transfer it to the medium of instruction. I'm going to leave it there because May's going to give you much more convincing examples of how this actually unfolds in the classroom. So take it away, May.
May, you're on mute.
Classic Zoom. Thank you, Sue, for laying that groundwork. So I hope I can step into those shoes. I'm going to talk about, yes, the educational potential of translanguaging. And I suppose if we ask the question, what is that potential? The first answer is that translanguaging approaches to learning place those multilingual students and their linguistic and their knowledge repertoires at the very centre of their own learning. And in contrast, when we look at very English dominant approaches, it looks like these multilingual students are sometimes sidelined in their own learning. So this is about building on top of and also building up that whole integrated repertoire that Sue was talking about and making it into a real learning resource. But it's not only saying, okay, the students have this resource, let them use it. It's about making this multilingual approach very much planned and purposeful. And what this means particularly in EAL or language classrooms, it's about connecting those horizontal repertoires. So multilingual students are able to communicate across a lot of different contexts using all those linguistic resources that they have. That's sort of a horizontal mode of communication. But what we look at in schools, and particularly with English learning, is very much a vertical repertoire of texts and language forms that students have to sort of climb up this ladder to get up to academic language there at the top. So it's about connecting those two dimensions. And some people perceive this contradiction here where we say translanguaging is unbounded, multilingual repertoires are integrated, but then we're still talking about teaching main languages. But we have to look at the reality of cultural practice, social practice, and in particular, educational policy that shapes the way students learn and are assessed at school. So this is the educational potential of translanguaging, but actually it's not just potential, it's a reality. And we're already seeing take up of plurilingual approaches to learning. Particularly, I can point you to the EAL curriculum and the resources being developed in Victoria. And in Julie's earlier slide, there was some examples there of the Victorian Department's literacy teaching toolkit, and I think there'll be a link to that later. But throughout this toolkit that Julie and I worked on, it's infused with these plurilingual approaches. So you can see that this is already coming out in educational policy and practice. And other examples include here in the ACT, year 11 and 12 colleges here are looking at ways for teachers to start, working multilingual approaches into inquiry. And we've also seen it in South Australia, where multilingual work that students have done has been really taken up in the assessment and moderation for senior students. So we're talking about potential, but that potential blossoms in reality. So it's a really wonderful thing to see. So what we have in, I suppose, this way of thinking about the educational potential of translanguaging is, on one hand, we have the expertise of the students in those horizontal repertoires. And this is things like using all their languages, bringing their funds of knowledge to the classroom, making connections with community. The things that we know that students do all the time outside of school. And we know that teachers are often really willing to allow students to use their home languages in class, but we also know that that's not enough to make it purposeful. So we want students to be able to build academic language, not only in English, but because we know that the development of their whole repertoire supports learning in English, learning of English, and learning holistically, that is so important. So it is teacher expertise that turns student practice into purposeful and effective learning. And that expertise comes from teachers understanding what students do, designing sequences of learning, managing what goes on in the classroom, explicitly teaching language, and particularly, I suppose, that's that vertical hierarchy of language. Teaching explicitly for transfer and building connections between what students know and do and the curriculum, and extending that, I guess, the BICs that students have often in their home languages into CALP as well, so that we're building that home language foundation at the same time as the students are building their English, academic English. So that sounds like a lot for teachers to be responsible for, but we know teachers are already responsible for a lot, and they have the opportunity in taking this approach to learn alongside their students and to push the edges of their comfort zones. And I like to characterise that as an opportunity, because any challenge is also an opportunity. But of course, there's also a need for professional learning for teachers around these pedagogies. But we can see, you know, with the kind of resources that are being developed and that are being published, that this kind of learning for teachers is really possible. So I suppose people are quite aware perhaps of the potential for translanguaging as a learning process, as something that students do to help them attach new knowledge to what they already know. But translanguaging can also be content for learning and the products of learning, which is really an aspirational sort of goal. So I'll talk about those three aspects as well. So on the next slide, we're looking at translanguaging as a learning process. So we go to the next one. Yeah. So these are things that I think would quite easily spring to mind of teachers and people who are familiar with using multiple languages. Now, the illustrations, the diagrams, and so on here are from the paper in the Australian Journal of Applied Linguistics Special Issues. So I've done that so that you can, you know, go back and check them out if you're interested. So we know from research that students use their multilingual repertoires to collaborate with each other. And that's often interpersonal and spoken, but it can also include online. So students might be explaining classroom activities or assessment tasks to each other. And this kind of evidence of this has been coming out in research for quite a number of years in all kinds of classrooms, from kindergarten to adult learning. We know that when students are talking to each other about what they're being asked to do or about their thoughts about learning, they might be using their home languages. They might be using lingua franca. For example, I've seen students, a student from Afghanistan whose home language is Hazaragi, but who has lived in Pakistan and learnt to speak Urdu, speaking with a student from India whose home language is Punjabi, but who also knows Hindi. And with Hindi and Urdu being mutually comprehensible, this is the language that students choose to speak rather than English, because that is what they're used to. They have the ability to make those choices within their repertoires. So it's very complex practice that can go on collaboratively. And this can also happen online. We know students, and I've worked mostly in high schools, that these students make use of chat, of social media, and they don't limit themselves to one language there either. But this kind of collaborative work can be planned in and facilitated by teachers, and that can include things like asking students to talk about prior knowledge, asking students to collaborate over understanding or creating text, and particularly things like talking over the finer points of grammar and written drafts when they're drafting each other's work. So this can all be done really purposefully. Students also use translanguaging individually, so this might include things like taking their own notes, making translations, recording their ideas, and you can see an example of that in the left-hand picture where we see Chinese characters with English handwritten notes. So this is a student from South Australia who was conducting research in Chinese for a topic related to Chinese language, and she was making those notes in English, partly to prove to the teacher that she was undertaking some very academic work, I suppose. But students can also do this in more hidden ways, you know, cognitively, so problem solving, idea generation, a lot of mathematics thinking, and applying previous learning is conducted by students often across their whole multilingual repertoires or in their home languages. And then as a learning process, translanguaging can also help students access sources of information, and that might be textbooks in another language or websites published in different languages. It can be news, media, but it can also be interpersonal information. So students may be able to access experts in their community. And the example on the right is from a student who interviewed someone in his Vietnamese community in Adelaide and was able to write about what he learnt from that interview. So all of this is a really rich way of looking at translanguaging as a learning process, and it's certainly something teachers can plan into and facilitate in their teaching. So on top of that, if we look at the next example, translanguaging can be content for learning. And we've already seen in this current slide that, you know, both of these students are doing research about topics and accessing information, one in Chinese, one in Vietnamese. But we can see on the next slide that not only accessing like research sources, but students' own translanguaging can become content for learning.
Hey, sorry, can you just try and advance the slide because it's not working on my side? So, and I think you've got, if I stop sharing, could you share your slide?
I will do my best, yes.
Sorry, it's just okay. not working for me.
That's cool.
Tried.
Thank you. What are we seeing here?
We thought we were going to have no tech problems this time.
So smooth. Okay. I'm not, oh my goodness.
It's fine, May, we can see it.
Is that okay like that?
Perfect.
All right.
Yeah.
Apologies. A bit messy. Okay. So this example, and maybe it's a little bit hard to sort of see the details, but this is an example where students' own practice becomes content for learning. And this is, to me, something, you know, this is the next step. This is something very exciting about how translanguaging has potential for education. So we can see in this example that the student, Rosalie, has used her text messages, which incorporate Tagalog and English, and used that in her Year 12 language study. This is a South Australian task, and analysed that so that she's talking about the audience, the purpose, the use of language in these text messages. And other examples, I mean, social media is so rich and students are really able to access those examples and talk about them. But other examples can include translated texts, which can be translated professionally, or things like fan translations of text can be human and machine translations. And students can analyse the linguistic and cultural elements of text like that. There's also multilingual text, things like videos with subtitles, government information related to, for example, public health, flat pack furniture instructions. And these kinds of multilingual texts are always worth interrogating, and students who have the ability to look at more than one language there are certainly bringing additional skills when they're doing that. Other types of translanguaging content might be multiple perspectives. So an easy example to think about is to listen to the sports commentary of, two countries competing at soccer, and you listen to the commentary on the Italian side and the commentary on the Brazilian side, and the types of comments and the way the action is described could be very different. There's also the perspectives of different people in the community. And I've had examples of students researching social issues who've been able to interview, for example, asylum seekers in their community using home language. And this is the type of information that a monolingual English speaker would never be able to access. So students can bring very privileged information to their learning. And then when we look at translanguaging as content, in terms of not only the types of content, but how this content can be used in learning, it can be that students are producing translanguaging content, they're analysing it, they might be reflecting on it, or they might be using it in research. So there's such a lot of potential there and variety. And I would like to add that when translanguaging is content for learning, we can bring linguistics into schools. And I've found that high school students, but there's also evidence from primary schools, and I'd point you to the work of Jacqueline Duarte in University of Western Sydney. But students make fabulous linguistics researchers, and they bring back some really exciting stuff. So it's well worth looking at. So I will move to the next one, so lastly, and this is maybe something that is more challenging to dominant practice, but translanguaging can be visible in the products of learning. And this might be examples of students producing multilingual texts for multilingual audiences. And these types of texts don't have to be things like videos with subtitles or translated public documents, but they can be academic texts that incorporate two different languages, and we can see an example of that on the screen. The top box where the student is writing about traditional and simplified Chinese characters, and she's writing about those features of language for an English-speaking audience. And then we can see how she's incorporated different language sources into her reference list there as well. Translation can be something that very young students can start undertaking with words and sentences and building up to longer texts. And some of you might be familiar with the idea of identity texts, which these are really well established in the literature. Jim Cummins has been writing about this from at least the 1990s, but probably before. And this is about students collaborating and bringing a translanguaging approach to developing and publishing texts from their own experience. And this is often narratives related to their lives, but we've done similar work with things like folk tales or recipes. So it can be expanded into the types of genres and text types that students are being asked to produce at school.
I might just jump in because it's 3:45.
Oh, sorry.
So no, that's okay. No, sorry. I just want to give Juliet a chance to wrap it.
Yes, of course.
Yep.
Yeah. Well, I mean, the last thing I'll say here is that, by students producing translanguaging texts or reflecting on translanguaging processes, this translanguaging becomes a lot more visible, and when it's visible in the products of learning, it starts to bring translanguaging in education into the realm of social action. And when it's seen by assessment boards and it's seen by the public, it starts to become powerful outside the experience of just those students. So I think that's something really valuable. Thank you. Now let me do this.
Julie, you need to unmute yourself. Maybe Julie can answer all the questions.
Classic. May, could you just scroll to one of the hidden slides? I actually want to pick up on your identity text idea there, because I think that's really important. Yeah, there we go. So this is a slide actually that I wasn't going to show, but I just thought it might come up, and it has. I usually use this with my students. If my students are out there looking at this, then yes, this is a recycle of a slide that we did in class. But I think the identity text is very, very important. And the one that May is talking about is the one in the middle there by Jim Cummins and Margaret Earley. In the Australian version, you'll see the Tell Me Your Story book, which is fantastic. It has a lot of activities and things like that that are based here in Australia. And yeah, a favorite of mine is this Authors in the Classroom. And this is a point that Esther de Jong makes, that when we're talking about EAL learners or multilingual learners, just good teaching, and she puts the acronym as JGT, is not enough. If empowerment here is the goal that we're working towards, and that's a lot of Jim Cummins's work in the area of pedagogy, is about transformation, transformative education. So if empowerment is part of that, and we're working towards transformation, then this JGT, oh yes, I have just good teaching skills, I don't really need to do more than this. This is not good enough. And we have to start to put our learners in the center and start to build texts that come from them. It's speaker-centered. That's the power of identity texts. So, an important thing here is getting to know your learners as multilingual learners who know and can do a lot already, and then to expand and to extend what they know and can do with new knowledge and skills. And so some of the examples here can be things like language portraits. And all of these can actually be done across primary, secondary, university, teacher education. I have been using it in every single context, and everybody has something to contribute here. So language portraits really developed widely by Brigitte Busch, and language mapping work by Jacqueline Duarte, and language grids, something I'm developing with my colleague Yvette Slaughter. Language diaries have been used in university contexts in Europe. So there's a lot going on here where we're really trying to, we're not talking about let's try to find out about our learners through surveys or the questionnaires. Let's get a spreadsheet, Excel spreadsheet open and put their hobbies. And it's really not like that. It's a very qualitatively different thing. And it's a really ethnographic approach to getting to know our students and hearing what they want to tell us. And this is really important about putting these learners in the center and really trying to understand who they are and getting to know them as multilingual speakers. Okay, so I just wanted to add that in because that was such an important point that May made there. May, can we just come back to my last slide? Because I'd like to just pull this all together by talking about our special issue and the work that we've been doing. So this is, as I said, we have been doing a lot of collaborative work together. This is a very recent thing that we did, but in our book, we looked at recognizing that complexity of context. Here, we tried to also think a bit more about, okay, so teaching and learning, yes, very important. And Sue's discussed that notion of language as a resource. May's given us the examples of how translanguaging as a resource manifests in the classrooms. And in working in this special issue, we came to think about, yeah, okay, so we understand the underpinning theory, we can see some practical examples, but what are the results? Or in other words, what does this translanguaging as a resource lens enable or activate in teaching and learning? And I think this is really important to ask because teachers and students want to know what the benefits and the advantages are. What can this thing do that other approaches, methods can't do in a sense? And maybe, yeah, other methods maybe can do them too, but we're really finding a lot of findings here that are very similar and really speak to the kinds of benefits that we're seeing cognitively and in terms of identity development. So I won't go through obviously every single thing here, but and you can go and download all of these articles for free because it's an open access journal. And as you can see, we've collected quite a few different articles from around the world. A lot of it is English medium countries. It's not surprising because there's so much tension there. And so there's a lot of studies coming out of these areas. Lots of different sectors and teaching and learning contexts. So I'll leave that up there for you to have a look at. But if I just start here in looking at Saskia Van Vegen's work in Canada, we found she was looking at secondary school mainstream classrooms. This was a classroom where teachers the teachers that she was working with valued translanguaging practices. So they were already multilingual friendly. And what she says is that when the teachers hold this translanguaging stance, it allows educators to position their learners differently as those who have these legitimate voices, experience and ways of learning. And I think this is also, really shown in May and Janet's work too, that, there's this enactment of both teachers and students' agency. So for the students, this is about a sharing of their multilingual practices. And for the teachers, it's their enactment of their multilingual policy and pedagogy. And also, I guess in May and Janet's work, the teachers naturally see the need to expand their learning designs to include more. And students, this more means, students' life worlds, their engagement of family members, multilingual school staff, etc. May, did I interpret that right? And did you want to add anything?
No, I think that's very clear. And I think maybe the thing that doesn't come through is that the journey for those teachers, it can be a little scary at first. You're doing something different, and particularly with senior secondary, you don't know how that's going to work out. It's a risk. But success brings confidence, and then, others can give it a go. It's very interesting and exciting to try as a teacher. It expands your own horizons.
Yeah. I wonder if I can just hop in. I see there are about 7 minutes left, and there's some amazing questions that have come through. I'm wondering whether...
Do you want me to handle the questions? I can...
Yeah, Julie, sorry, I didn't want to cut you short. Okay. I just thought it might be good to maybe bring in some of those issues in response to the questions as well.
Yeah, absolutely.
Yeah, I've been watching the questions. I can pick them out and then you can answer, Sue, rather than... Do you want me to do that, or do you want to do it?
Yeah, no, you do it. Phil, you take it away.
Okay,
and we'll...
so maybe first is a question from Jae Hyun Kim. Jae, who's from the Linguistics Department here. He's picked up the idea of translanguaging as an integrated communication system. And he's asking, is there a basis to suggest that one should achieve a certain level of proficiency in each of their languages to use their languages as an integrated communication system? So Jay, if you want to come, do you want to answer first? And if Jay wants to unmute himself and come back, that'd be fine.
I suppose I could speak to this in terms of classroom practice in particular. Students bring their, I guess, their multilingual repertoires at whatever state they are in, and they use them in that state. So teachers or students might be nervous about whether their language is good enough, but anything that students can bring in can be used as a resource. And I guess what we have here is, at the moment, the educational approaches are really tipped towards monolingual English speakers in particular. And if we can tip that balance towards students being able to use any bits of language, any bits of any languages that they have in the classroom, it's very useful. And one exercise that I found really useful, and I did this with a Japanese class, is to say, what do you know in Japanese? And some of these students were real beginners, but they already knew things like sushi and karaoke. And so students can start to become more aware of their own multilingual repertoires. And there's usually more to them than they think. And that is also very revealing for teachers.
And can I just add, Jay, thanks for the question. Hi, Jay. One of the slides I cut from my section was the whole idea of the threshold hypothesis, which actually does provide a basis for a level of proficiency for students to get that maximum benefit from moving between languages. So really, I guess the impact of the threshold hypothesis on us as teachers is that we really do want to be continuing to develop skills in the home language while we're developing skills in the medium of instruction, because that's when you get the full cognitive and socio-emotional benefits of multilingualism, when there's an adequate level of proficiency in 2 or 3 or more languages. So we can talk more about that, Jay. Thanks for the question.
Could we go, there's a couple of connected questions from Hannah Tosh and Aggie Bodis, from both from in linguistics. Hannah was talking about implications, I think. So she says, I'd like to ask what you think about the idea that parents are actually being quite sensible in wanting their kids to shift to English. I think Hannah's being devil's advocate. Yeah. Given the devaluing of languages in education. And he asked, how do you think researchers and educators can address this without seeming to put yet another burden on migrant parents? And Aggie has also asked, well, she's just pointed out that there are EAL or ELT teachers network sites which encourage parents to use English for parts of the day, during dinner, during a walk in the park, and so on. And what do you think about that in terms of L1 maintenance? So they're getting contradictory.
Yeah, those are brilliant questions, and I'd love to answer, but I'm gonna hand over to Julie and May first, because they'll probably say the same thing as I'm gonna say.
I think one of a piece of research that I've done more recently in Vietnam with David Noonan was looking at young learners. They were learning in blended learning programs, and they're, in places like Vietnam, South Korea, and these were the 2 sites we looked at. Parents feel very strongly about the learning of English, and they go to extraordinary extents to make sure that the kids are learning English at a very, very young age. So we looked at primary school children, years about 2 to 4. And we talked to the parents, we talked to the principals, the teachers, and the children. We did observations, we did interviews, and so on. The gist of it is that, yes, when you talk to the parents say, oh yes, English is so important, and it's a policy thing, and all this, if they want to get ahead in the world, they need English and all this. But actually, we got into more dialogue, and when we started to ask the parents about what do you actually want your kids to be able to do with these languages, most of the parents, I tell you, at the end of the day said, we just want them to speak naturally, like they speak their first language, and we just want them to be happy. We want them to be themselves in these languages. So, you know, it really made me think a lot about that trip, you know, talking to them. It required a lot of time, but, you know, and not imposing my ideas, but in a sense, like the parents needed some education too. They needed some other perspectives and ways of thinking about English also, because they're bombarded with all these ideas about English left and right, about policy and their own desires for their children, things that they couldn't have and all these other things. But in fact, if you drill it down, parents did want their kids to be happy, and they loved that their kids were bilingual. Many of the parents said that and the kids said exactly the same thing when we interviewed them separately, that they had set times at home where they would speak English, and they had set times when the kids would go to play basketball at the international school so they could use English. The kids themselves were playing online games, and so they were picking up American accents like crazy. And so they had a very fluid and open way of doing things, even though there was structure involved. But at the end of the day, you can see that the philosophical underpinning for them is, I want you to be happy. I want you to be able to use this language freely, naturally. So yeah, they wanted to expose the children. So I think that would be my answer.
Mm.
Could we squeeze in one or two more questions?
Yeah, sure.
Yeah,
sure.
rather than have several replies to,
Sure.
I think it's a great answer, Julie. Thanks for that. Especially because the next question is from me.
That's a bit.
I was asking, looking at your examples that you've shown of practices in classroom, is really how that relates to the idea of subjects in primary or secondary school. I don't know, we don't really have subjects in primary, right? But we do in secondary. And what's the place for this? Is it something that has to happen across the curriculum, or is it? I also feel maybe it should be also in English, because we should maybe problematize the idea of English courses or English class in school and think about maybe it should be multiliteracy or it should be languages or something, rather than, no, that's part of the problem that we have, that English occupies such a big part in the curriculum.
Well, I mean, if our goal is to support EL learners to access the content of their curriculum subjects, then translanguaging has a fundamental role to play in science, history, maths, all of those subjects, because, you know, if you can tell the time in Hindi, you can do maths, but you can't do it in English because you don't have the vocabulary. So we need to be able to translanguage in the maths classroom, which means the maths teacher needs to understand the role of translanguaging. So we are sneakily getting it into our master's programs here when we do our curriculum courses for students across different key learning areas. So all of our teachers have some exposure to translanguaging. We wish we had a whole year. We only have 2 lectures. So, you know, but at least it's on the radar.
Yeah. Yeah.
You know, but of course it's a little bit dispiriting for them when they go into their teaching pracs and the supervising teacher says, well, we don't do that here. That's for the languages teacher or the English teacher, you know. Yeah. So.
Okay. Could we take one more question I think it'll be the last question, but before I do, can I just say that I've posted links to the special issue of Australian Journal of Applied Linguistics in the chat. So if you want to follow, anybody wants to follow that, and also a link to the, sorry, what was that called? The Tell Me Your Story.
Tell Me Your Story.
It's not, you can't download it. I think you have to buy it, but I've given a link to the page. And also Tina Detweiler has posted a link to a presentation she's giving.
Right.
Which like it's relevant. So thank
you.
Could I just say something? The thing that May talked about in terms of the work that we did in the Victorian curriculum. I think that's all freely available online. So I don't know, May, can you just quickly just go to that slide? Because you'll see that there's a literacy teaching toolkit, and teachers can go in there and find the EAL advice for teaching different types of techniques. And what was really wonderful for us was that we were able to put in our ideas about plurilingualism in the EAL advice, which, you know, it's a really big step if you think about it. It was only made possible because plurilingualism is now an actual strand in the Victorian new EAL curriculum, which was supposed to be, well, it was supposed to be rolled out and implemented this year, but this year is a weird year. So anyway, but next year we expect that teachers are going to be really like working with this. So we have a whole site there in the department's website that really frames the EAL students as plurilingual. Here it is. This is the underpinning of this work. And then if you look underneath there, there's that literacy teaching toolkit map.
Which is so inspiring for us in New South Wales, and we can only hope to be there one day.
If you could post that link, mate, if you could post a link to that, mate.
I'll do my best.
Fantastic if you can. Can we, one last question?
Yeah.
And this is the power of Zoom seminars. This question's coming from the University of the Philippines, Visayas, from Jessie Labis, who's in the Philippines.
Oh.
The question is basically, I think it's a very frequent question. Is there a need for teachers to have strong levels of proficiency in the various languages that are used in the classroom?
Who wants to take that one?
Me?
Yeah.
Yeah. Oh. Sorry. So
multitasking.
Yeah, I am multitasking. Here we go.
Thanks for that link. The link is in the chat. Let's put the link in the chat.
The very short answer is no. But actually, what teachers need is training and confidence to be able to facilitate translanguaging of their students in the classroom. And one of the biggest challenges that teachers talk about there is that they don't feel the sense of control that they might be used to in terms of knowing what's happening in their classroom and being able to manage how students are interacting and what they're coming up with. So it can be a really big change in mindset for teachers. But some teachers who have made that step have actually found it to be to really open up their teaching so that they're learning a lot more from their students. So personal experience with translanguaging and multilingual repertoire can help teachers be confident to take that step and to support translanguaging from their students. But I guess in theory, any teacher can learn to do that. Yeah.
Yeah, I just wanted to say one more thing, May, because I think we've had this conversation before, and it also relates to our work, our collaboration together, all the three of us, and it probably finishes off this talk too. But, you know, we've talked about how, you know, sometimes you can have a few enthusiastic teachers who are kind of like-minded. They come together and they work bottom up. And this is what I'm seeing in schools. When they work bottom up, don't wait for you know, your principal, some new government to come in and do something. When the teachers join forces and they're like-minded, they're just, you know, they just want to get teaching and learning happening. And I want to see some effective like results. And that's which all teachers want to do, right? So when they come together and they work bottom up, my goodness, change does happen. Transformation happens in that school. Like people come around and say, hey, what are you doing? And oh, what's that about? And you know, and then everybody wants to do it, right? So
and that's the perfect counter to Hannah's question about, you know, it's sensible for parents to just, you know, maintain the status quo because that's what the top-down policy says. but bottom up can be very powerful antidote to that. And I think that's an amazing point to finish on.
Yeah,
it's really, really
yeah.
cool.
And I just wanted to say that's the work that Sue, May, and I think are trying to do here too. Like, you know, we're like these separate people, and you know, we meet each other in a conference, and we're like, hey, you know, kind of like similar ideas. Like, let's get together. So it is not easy to do in teacher education either. This is really hard work to put translanguaging in this quite radical but practical, but you know, really radical kind of way of, you know, thinking about language, and trying to do that in our schools is really, really hard work. So, you know, we need the partnerships, and we need to work ground up together, and we're doing, you know, what we can to, you know, really join forces and collaborate, not just, you know, people just bringing their work together, but really to collaborate genuinely.
Definitely.
Okay, that's a really great note to, positive note to finish on. And I really want to thank first May and Julie for coming so far to be with us today. And also to Sue for also coming across the campus to the Linguistics Department. And for getting this seminar together. It's been fantastic. Seminar, I think. What I'm going to do is I'm going to stop the recording of the seminar, but the room will still be open for a few minutes. So if people want to unmute themselves and say hello, have a chat, go ahead. But I'm going to stop the recording of the seminar at least. And we'll be here for about 10 minutes or so.
Thanks very much, Phil. That's great.
Thanks, Phil.
Thanks.
Thank you. That was terrific.
Thank you. Oh, hi, Jackie.